Very welcome from Middle East Institute, National University of Singapore. Uh, I welcome, my name is Asif Shuja. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at Middle East Institute, your host today. And we have gathered here to have our webinar on the topic Iran-GCC dynamics and regional security. And towards that end, on behalf of my institution, Middle East Institute, I welcome all the dignitaries, professors, academics, and from all walk of life who have joined us this afternoon from Singapore. And we are here joined with three stellar panelists from different parts of the world. And I would like to introduce them uh, for this conference. We have the first speaker for this afternoon's talk, whose name is Dr. Abdullah Sagar. He is a Saudi expert on Gulf politics and strategic issues. He is the founder and chairman of the Gulf Research Center, a global think tank based in Jeddah with a well-established worldwide network of partners and offices in both the Gulf region and Europe. He has also chaired and moderated Syrian opposition meetings in Riyadh. Dr. Sagar holds a PhD in politics and international relations from Lancaster University. Welcome, Dr. Sagar. We also have Dr. Abdullah Babood, who is an academic from Oman, who is currently the chair of the State of Qatar for Islamic Area Studies and a visiting professor at the School of International Liberal Studies, Waseda University in Tokyo, Japan. He previously held the position of the director of the Gulf Studies Center at Qatar University and the director of the Gulf Research Center at the University of Cambridge, UK. Welcome, Dr. Babood. He was also our former colleague here at Middle East Institute. Our third speaker is Dr. Dina Asfandiari, who is a senior advisor at the International Crisis Group for the Middle East and North Africa. Previously, she was a fellow in the Middle East Department of the Century Foundation and an International Security Program research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Balfour Center for Science and International Affairs. We welcome Dr. Dina Asfandiari. And just a small announcement related to our third speaker, Dr. Asfandiari. She had a very pressing engagement right after this, right during this time, but she has kindly agreed to stay up until the major portion of question and answer. So after 1 hour or so, she may be leaving us slightly early from the scheduled time. But we thank you so much for sticking around, Dr. Svandyari. And before going ahead with our three speakers, let me just inform the usual techniques related to asking question answer related to question answer round. You have the two different functions. You can either type your question in the chat function and I can either read it out. Otherwise, you may use the full functionality of Zoom, that is microphone or video, which is very rare. Very few organizations provide the full Zoom function. We do that. So please have the full utility, use it fully. And before going ahead with the three speakers, let me just introduce very briefly this topic, because all of us have gathered here and we all know the current dynamics under which we are discussing this Iran-GCC relationship, because two very important events have happened and all of us are aware, the Abraham Accords, through which four important countries have normalized their relationship with Israel, and there's a talk that more can join. So in one way, it actually gives increased legitimacy to Israel and also enhances the partnership or the friendship with some other Arab countries. So this is a new dimension in the geopolitics of Middle East that has been added. The other important element that is currently happening is the nuclear talk with Iran that the world power are doing, especially for the resurrection of this particular deal by the reintroduction of USA as a partner who had actually left that deal. So these are two important events under which we are looking at the relationship between two important elements of the entire security parameter of the Middle East. that is Iran at one side and GCC at other side. So we know the major countries of GCC, especially Saudi Arabia, also have very important role to play here. So we will look at into three different aspects in our webinar. The first, of course, we will look into the major security parameters for two different sides, GCC at one side and Iran at the other side. What are their respective security concerns? So our first speaker, Dr. Svandyari, will highlight that particular aspect. Then we will move on to the second aspect of this particular thing, and that would be to look into the common fields of cooperation or partnership between these two different regions, whether there are some low-hanging fruits that we can grab, and there could be a better peace deal between these two regions, and that that will be covered by our second speaker, Dr. Sagar. And by amalgamation of all these elements that we have gathered from these two speakers, and we will now turn on to our third speaker, Dr. Babood, who would be trying to look into whether there is a possibility of any security arrangement at a broader level, looking into the major interest of these two particular elements, that is Iran and GCC. And of course, we would be very delighted if he could also look into some other players very briefly, like for instance, Israel, which is very important player in the region. How does this security arrangement aids or abates their own respective security concerns? So with these few introductory words, we now move on to our first speaker, Dr. Dina Svandyari. Dr. Svandyari, the floor is yours. You may speak for 10 minutes and all the speakers may speak for 10 to 15 minutes. Then we can move to questions around. Thank you so much, Dr. Svandyari.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for your invitation. It's a pleasure to be amongst you and a pleasure to share the stage with Dr. Sagar and Dr. Babood. As you've already said, I'm going to talk a little bit about security perceptions in the region and just give a quick overview of that before we move on. So generally, I would argue that security perceptions in the region are really quite mismatched. The GCC states tend to view Iran as a greater concern than Iran views them. Iran tends to historically view them as more of a nuisance and a lesser security concern than the other way around. And that's because Iran aspires to play in the big leagues, to work with the big major powers. But for the GCC, amongst others, Iran really is a primary security threat. I'll start with the Iranian side. So for Iran, its objectives technically are no different to any other state in its foreign policy. It wants to preserve its territorial integrity. It wants to secure its borders. It wants to expand ties with other countries and increase its influence in the region. And it wants to be a force to be reckoned with, generally. Tehran believes that regional security should be managed by the states in the region, which again is another area where there's a bit of a mismatch of perceptions. Its priorities tend to be global. So it focuses on dealing with the US, with the Europeans, on having a seat at negotiating tables for major issues, on dealing with the P5+1, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council in Germany, on the nuclear front. In the region, I would argue Iraq is its #1 priority. That's because it shares a porous border of over 900 miles. It has a real constituency in Iraq. It's a partner, particularly at a time, like an economic and political partner, particularly at a time where the world powers were trying to isolate Iran. And of course, the last time Iran and Iraq didn't see eye to eye, Iran had to suffer an 8-year devastating war. So it wants to make sure that that will never be repeated. Then in order of priority, I think its second priority really is Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a major issue for Iran because it's a real success story. It is an example, a perfect example from Tehran's perspective of how its model of increasing its influence in the region through non-state actors works. And so for that reason, it really wants to maintain and nurture that relationship. And then lower down, you have Syria, for example, which is its last real state ally. And after that, comes the Gulf Arab states and Yemen. I think Yemen is an even lesser concern than the Gulf Arab states because to Iran's eyes, it has no real interests in Yemen, and it uses Yemen more as a chip to be a nuisance to Saudi Arabia rather than to do anything concrete with it. Today, so those are its global priorities. Today, there are a couple of key themes that Iran has in its foreign policy and in its security concerns. First is a frustration at the JCPOA process. A lot of Iranians are surprised at where they are today and why they're still here and why this process is dragging out. And also they firmly believe that there's no room for discussion on anything else with the world powers until this is resolved first. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not willing to hold discussions on regional issues, as we're going to see, but the idea that it can talk about anything else with the major powers before dealing with the nuclear issue, I think is kind of off the table. The problem with this whole JCPOA process is the impact it's going to have on the region, which will feed into GCC perceptions of Iran, of course. Iran is likely to lash out, similar to what it has so far in the region, no matter what happens. If a deal doesn't happen, then Iran has an incentive to do some chest thumping in the region and show that it's a force to be reckoned with as payback for not allowing the nuclear deal to be resolved, basically. If we do get to a resolution of the nuclear issue, then it's very possible that much like after 2015, Iran will also lash out to a certain extent, although in my view, lesser in the region, because it has to show that, okay, we made compromises in one area, so now we're going to act up in another. So that's one area, the frustration with the JCPOA process. The second is this tension it has with the Gulf Arab states. For Iran, it's also a nuisance. It wants to resolve some of these tensions, but it remains a useful pressure point in the region because the Gulf Arab states are generally close to the US. And of course, they are within proximity of Iran. So it's easy to target their infrastructure and their interests in the region. Iran so far, I think, has decided it's going to pick apart the Gulf Arab states and deal with them bilaterally rather than dealing with them as a group. And then the third thing that it's looking at right now is these normalization agreements. At the beginning, I think the Iranians thought this isn't really much of a game changer. It's more of the same. The Gulf Arab states have been dealing with Israel for a very long time, and Iran knows it. Today, I think there is a little bit of nervousness creeping into the way the Iranians view these deals because they're noticing the military dimensions of the deal. The fact that the Israelis now have access to Persian Gulf waters and ports in the region, that's a concern. The fact that the Israelis and the Emiratis are talking about things like missile defense potentially and drones, that's a concern. So that's another thing that Iran is looking at. I'm now going to move to the other side of the Gulf very quickly and talk a little bit about GCC security perceptions. And of course, my co-panelists can fill in because I think they're better placed than I am to talk about it. For them, Iran is one of their main rivals. It's an ideological rival, it's a religious rival, and even represents a different state system, a different vision for what a state should look like in the region. And this rivalry is long-standing. We tend to attribute it to to the starting point to the Islamic Revolution in 1979, but even before this government, the rivalry was there. Even under the Shah, there was a rivalry, particularly between the Saudis and the Iranians. Although obviously the ideological dimension got worse after the revolution. For the Gulf Arab states, Iran's influence and immersion into Arab affairs is a real problem. They want it to get out. And they're frustrated with the model that the Iranians use to spread their influence. So this idea that Iran reaches out to proxies in the region. Other security concerns of the Gulf Arab states are widespread. Of course, there's the idea of Islamism, which poses a problem to some members of the GCC, the Emiratis in particular, who see a lot of things through the prism of the spread of Islamism in the region and how that poses a threat to their vision and their model of secular Islam. And more importantly, I would argue in some respects, particularly today, this fear of what the US is going to do in the region. There is a certain security dependence on the Americans, although I would argue that is lesser now than it was a few years ago. And this idea that the US is leaving or pivoting away from the region poses a real problem. It is no longer a reliable ally. This started as early as the Arab Spring and has been building up over the course of the last few years. Today, Iran still remains a key concern for the Gulf Arab states, although for some of them, obviously lesser so. I know I'm generalizing, but for example, for the Omanis, Iran isn't a security threat. They are used to engaging with the Iranians, for example. As a result of this threat, diversification for them has become key. They've built relationship with other security partners. Their ultimate goal is to be self-sufficient in their security, but in the meantime, they understand that that can't be achieved, and so it's important for them to talk to the Russians, to the Chinese, and to really build relationships with others. And this is the context in which we've had the normalization agreements, the development of relations with different countries in Asia, for example. They also want to increase influence, much like Iran does, in the region, either by mimicking the Iranian model of reaching out to non-state actors or actors on the ground, or by just filling the void by building relationships with states in the region. And actually today, you can argue that it's no longer just in the region. There was a point where, particularly after the Arab Spring, where the focus was the Middle East, but today it goes far beyond it. You have different members of the Gulf Arab states involved in various arenas in Africa and pursuing their own interests in a very self-assured manner in both the Middle East and beyond. And actually, even in the Europe and US, with all the efforts that they're putting in lobbying. So to finish off, basically, you can really see that there is a clear mismatch in security perceptions in the region, which I think is part of the reason why we've had these tensions for so long between the Gulf Arab states and Iran. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Esfandiari, for laying out the groundwork, because it's very important to know the perspectives of both sides, because only then one can actually get into meaningful conversation. So, I mean, immediately now we'll go to our next speaker, Dr. Sagar, who will tell us about whether there is any ground, or what are those exact grounds on which cooperation can be built between these two powers. Dr. Sagar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be today with such a wonderful panelist and also a great audience that you have. And I've been cooperating with your university since many years, but it's glad to be back again on the scene. Well, talking about regional security, it's an extremely important issue for us here in the region. I think Dr. Esfandiari, she laid out the concern of both sides quite well, but at the same time, maybe I would like to add a few things, to that one. And how does the perception, being seen from our part, at least from the Gulf region here. We believe that, we don't have, Iran still represents the threat, and the threat perception is there because of the act and the behavior of the Iranian government in the region. And it's not only today, she's right, it started at the time of Shah, when the Shah of Iran thought he was the policeman of the Gulf. Second, also when the revolution came up with the idea of exporting the revolution and moving from another, to a different country, and also encourage sectarianism in the region, that also became a great and a big concern. In my opinion, I think seeing today, Iran are against any presence of international forces. They're not really in agreement, with us in the region. So they would like to have the region free of any forces. They believe they are the largest power, and they will have whatever framework agreement, with the region, but no international forces. The Gulf country feels that they don't have the enough capacity, and their enough capacity is not really good enough to bring or to have alone themselves to respond to any threat, coming from Iran. At the same time, the nuclear issue, of course, became, on the table, but maybe we have two different here views between us and the West. The West believe nuclear issue is the most important issue. We believe, nuclear issue is an international issue and it's an international responsibility, and they need to deal with that, and they have to deal, with that. But still, the set of the agenda that is a big concern for us is the maritime security, is the security of the energy platform, is the interventionist policy, is the expansionist policy of Iran, is support of terrorism, is support of militia. All those issues are equally important because this is much more regional dimension, for our security of concern, while the international community look at only the issue of missiles and the nuclear, because also Israel has an input here. Israel believe there should be zero enrichment here, while the region believe whatever applicable to Iran could be applicable to us. And this is why we call for a free zone of WMD. And that's not really accepted by Iran because Iran is still insisting that, Israel first, and, free zone of WMD, which is a larger Middle East, and the Israeli do not recognize the NPT, neither the additional protocol, while the other Gulf countries and Iran, they do recognize the additional protocol. I mean, the NPT and some of them, the additional protocol. So where are we today with that one? I think we have 4 initiatives, that came out. One was MESA by the US, but again, Iran believe MESA, it's tailor-made to incorporate Israel and it's against them. So this is why it's not acceptable by Iran. Second, we have the Russian proposal, and the American will never accept the Russian proposal in the region here because still they believe, they want to be on the region. And at the same time, the Russian proposal really has no real detail on that. Third is the, Hormuz initiative by President Rouhani, where he talked about non-interventionist and non-aggression, which is fine for the region, but at the same time, the region, they wanted to backward, not really only from today, which means you have supported the Hezbollah, as Dr. Sfandiari called it, from the Iranian government perspective, as a success story, or the Houthi, or even the militia has been. Iran have chosen to deal with a violent non-state actor and militia in the region rather than dealing with government in terms of any implementation or any policies issues. And of course, the fourth was the European, and the European primarily focusing in some of the maritime because of the importance for them. But I think in the end of the day, what we need to have is a blended sort of a structure between all the different proposal to reach to a sort of understanding. And then what the key issue will be is who will be the guarantor and how that sort of guarantor can play a role. Is it only the US and the B5+1, or is it B5+1 plus United Nations and the EU? What sort of guarantor, how that can act, who will observe, what will happen? I think it still is a big ambiguity at this stage. Even if you look at the late discussion between Saudi Arabia and Iran that took place in Iraq, that's primarily focused on Yemen and on reestablishing the diplomatic relation that Iran is keen for that because of the Hajj and Umrah questions. So but still there are many, many points I think not to be really addressed, and they are far from reaching anything. Going through the current situation today in Vienna talk, I think the Gulf country, they have not been consulted in the first JCPOA 2015. And when they were consulted, and we've had the team from the Britain, Germany, and France visiting the region here, talking to the different Gulf countries to address or to listen to their concern. Their concern was not taking in account on the current negotiation on the JCPOA, but at the same time, still the Gulf countries remains hopeful that with the alliances they have, this will address really a lot of their concern, which they have stated it very clearly to the different envoys and specialized committee on that, whether from the EU or the US and so on. But where are we today on the Vienna? I think there is an Iranian demand of compensation of losses, of release of sanction that was imposed on JCPOA, and also removing sanction from the Murshid, from Khamenei and some of the political leaders around him. While the negotiators from the other side are looking to see that the 60% enriched uranium should be removed, even the 20%, and then to dismantle the equipment that the centrifusion, the new centrifusion they have developed, all this high enriched uranium, either to remove it outside the country or to do whatever things that can be done there. So with all of that, it really comes the point, how far JCPOA will move. Are we going to have a real agreement now? Or that's going to, talking to some of the friends in Vienna, they say it could be a week, it could be a month, it could be a year. Still, we don't know how things are going there and what sort of final stage. But in principle, the Gulf countries have said, fine, US can go back to JCPOA. This is their decision. We cannot change it. But at the same time, what we need to, everybody to take in account our concern of the security agenda that we have here in the region. Addressing also how do we move forward from here? I think any security architecture take into account all the concern of all the parties. And I think security architecture here must include the 6 GCC countries, Iraq, Iran, and Yemen. And I think the Gulf countries and Saudi Arabia in particular are in support of such things. They would like to see such things to be in place. But at the same time, with the proper guarantee that can really assure and ensure the continuation of such things. Still, Iran has a lot of interest in the region. It's a big country. And also living in peace and focusing in development will benefit the Iranian people much more than the current suffering situation, whether it's in economic or in the currency issue or in the inflation rate that's taking place, or even some of the political and security disturbance that they are living with. What we are not willing, of course, to accept is the issues that I've mentioned, the interventionist policy using sectarianism as a dimension. That's what happened in Iraq. We never had a border with Iran. We have a border with Iraq on Kuwait and Iraq, but at the same time now having the Iranian supported militia in Iraq acting on their behalf, so the proxy, it makes it very difficult. Seeing also the situation in Syria and how they are supporting that one, it looks also quite difficult to see there. Hezbollah, which really disturbed the creation of the government. Houthi, after receiving a 300 missiles, ballistic missile coming to Saudi Arabia with the drone and the boat, that was not really made by the Yemeni. It was supplied technically. This is why also in the missiles we differentiate, between the sovereignty right of Iran of developing their own missile and preserving it, and the different issue which is manufacturing and exporting it to a violent non-state actor like Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthi, and all these people that really are using it against civilian and against country in the region here. So without changing the act and the behavior in Iran, it's very difficult to have a normalized relation, despite of some of the Gulf countries that they do have, similarly less tension and less escalated level of tension. But I think in terms of security perception, it remains very high in both sides. It's true Iran do not perceive the Gulf country as a threat unless the US is there with them. And at the same time, the GCC countries still perceive Iran as a sort of real threat because it's practical. It's there, it's on the field. We see it, by the way how they act and they behave. On the Abraham Accord, by the way, I'll just mention a few words. Saudi Arabia position was Bahrain and UAE is a sovereign state. Out of the 57 country member in the Organization of Islamic Countries, I think there's 28 countries that they have diplomatic relation with Israel. So that's a sovereign issue. We're not going to interfere. But maybe those countries, they did look at it from this point that normalization will bring peace. The way Saudi Arabia see it, maybe, no, we need peace first and then we move to normalization. And that's the big difference at this stage between both sides. However, I think Saudi, since whatever happened in Hamas, they've closed the airspace on the Israeli flight and so. And at the same time, they remain in support with the Palestinian Authority. Saudi Arabia have contributed more than $6 billion to the Palestinian Authority over the period of time, and also have continuously to endorse all their political issues. And they've held an Arab League and OIC meeting, and they support a lot of the statement at the UN and the Security Council. But the Ibrahim Accord, it doesn't have really a military ties in it as far as the framework. Maybe unilaterally, as Dr. Sfandiari mentioned, UAE and Israel, they're talking, but I think it's still far premature. And I don't think the tradition of Israeli have even fought on behalf of other country or to a certain territory. No, that did not happen. Second, the Israeli, are concerned about the security, but they wanted to, to have a closer relation because maybe this will help them in terms of the reconnaissance. But also, they do have their own submarine in the Arabian Sea. They do have their own reconnaissance system, which they can use. So for the Israelis, still Iran remains as a big threat. They wanted to see a zero enrichment in Iran. They do not wish to see any enrichment capability there or so. So looking at all this picture, the international players are very important, i.e. United States primarily, but then China and Russia can be a supporter or they can be an obstacle, but they do like to take in account Iran interest, because also for the US establishing a new alliances consist of Australia, Japan, South Korea, and India. The only way for China to balance that is to look at Iran and Pakistan. This is the two main countries, to offset that and to balance that sort of alliances. So we do not wish to see a new Cold War era in the region. We do not wish to see a fight between the US and the Russian or the Chinese, or even major dispute. We would like still to see an economic prosperity and much more development on that. This is in general what I have to say, and I'll be happy to take questions unless there is something very precise you want me to comment on it. I'll be happy to.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sagar. I think you have very nicely laid out the logistics of the security arrangement that we may, now proceed with Dr. Abdullah Babu to, work on. And now I actually go to Dr. Babu, and we would like to have his views on what are his takes, especially under the paradigm of the 4 different security architecture that you have mentioned, and the role of the great powers, especially the Quad that you have mentioned, where these 4 countries are there. So I would like to invite Dr. Babu on the floor to have his view on the broader security arrangement of the Gulf region. Dr. Babu.
Thank you very much, Dr. Asif Shuja, and for this kind invitation. It's a great pleasure and honor to be with friends and colleagues, very distinguished friends and colleagues on this panel. And always a great honor to be with you at MEI with friends and colleagues there. Really miss you, and greetings from Tokyo to all of you. You made my role rather difficult and easy. Difficult, I have to come up with something new, and easy to just recycle some of the ideas that has been put through. So let me start by just saying that I agree with the colleagues of what they have said, and I think it shows that there are different perceptions when we talk about security. And when we talk about security in the Gulf or in the region, the question is security of whom? Who are we talking about here? When it is seen from the prism of the United States or the West, it's security of the Western military power there, and security of the oil supply. When it's seen from Iran, it's obviously security of the regime and the state, of course, as Dina had mentioned. And of course, in this respect, they have issues with Western powers' presence in the region. When it's seen from the Gulf states, it's a completely different view altogether. It's Iran, it's Iraq, it's all the different things, sectarianism, all of that has been mentioned by the colleagues. So security of whom is always important. Is it also security of the regimes as well? And how does regimes look at security? And sometimes regime security and state security are two conflated concepts. And then we have, I think we also need to kind of consider, while we are talking about security, what kind of security or security challenges are we facing? Is it hard security? Is it soft security? And again, there is a link between them as well. There seems to be a lot of focus on hard security, when soft security is actually quite challenging. And we are seeing, whether it's COVID-19 or the economic crisis or sectarianism and ideologies that are spreading in the region, can also lead to some of it to conflicts in the region. But in the midst of this balancing game that the region is engaged in, those kind of securities are forgotten. Not even to forget climate change and the impact of that, and water security, food security. All of those things have to be taken into consideration, and I'll bring those back later on if you like. But I think it is important to consider those kind of securities when we are talking about. Obviously, as we have heard from my friends and colleagues, that Iran sees security differently from the Gulf states. But I will also add, there isn't a consensus within the Gulf states in terms of how they do see Iran as a security challenge. Some of them see it as a security threat. Some of them see it as a security challenge, and some also differ in terms of how to deal with this. How do you confront that? Is it through confrontation or through dialogue and diplomacy? So those are issues that we also need to look at when we're looking at security in the region. Obviously, there is no consensus, as we've just heard, but also there is no consensus within the Gulf states, because the definition of security is different. The security perception or threat perception is also different from the Gulf state. So with that kind of introduction, let me just add to another dimension to this, and that is, despite all the challenges that the region is facing, not only because of, and I agree, it's not only because of the the Islamic Republic, but even before, the region has not been able to develop any kind of a security architecture that is comprehensive, that is inclusive, that can lead to at least some kind of a dialogue taking place and diplomacy and some confidence building measures that can be done through this mechanism. The GCC deliberately excluded Iran, Iraq, and Yemen, and it was an exclusive club for the monarchies. I can well understand that for maybe good reasons why they did that. However, it did not develop to find another alternative or another mechanism, even linked to the GCC, not necessarily within the core GCC, but it's like the Asian Regional Forum, for example, with ASEAN, where other countries are being invited to talk about common security, and also to talk about common cooperation as well. So we actually lack that. So there is there is exclusivity in the region, and this is what we are seeing, which create misperception, which create all these ideas that we are, problems that we are talking about. And obviously, the whole idea of regional hegemon hasn't died away. And this is something that is, coming back to haunt us. Obviously, this rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran is each one of them wants to be the regional hegemon. And that is, of course, dangerous, and no one is going to accept that. in the region, and we've seen how much costly it has been to the region, and obviously it's mutated to beyond the region nowadays, and we can see that Iran, in its aspiration to be a hegemonic power in the region, not only in the Gulf but beyond, we see that it's challenging Israel, and we want to do this defensive posture against Israel by arming Hezbollah and all of that. And now, because of the Abraham Accord, we are seeing that Israel is slowly moving into the region, into the Gulf waters. And that also is going to complicate the picture. And if the rivalry between these two major regional countries, that is Iran and Saudi Arabia, is not enough, we are now seeing even middle countries in the region, or middle powers, that are emerging, and they are themselves seeing perhaps that there is a role for them. Obviously, this is happening at the time when there is a sense of abandonment because of the policies of the United States, or at least this perception that there is going to be an abandonment, and there's a lot of hedging going on at the moment with the other international powers, whether it is the Europeans, but also we're seeing it with the Russians and the Chinese, and even with the Indians. And again, just internationalizing all these problems without facing it head on to try and sort it out. So I think if you like me to end here, is I would say what the region really needs is a little bit of common sense. And that common sense is no one can really be the real hegemon in the region. Countries bandwagon, countries get help and hedge against each other. And the only way that this can be done is by having some kind of a mechanism where these ideas are actually discussed in a diplomatic manner through some kind of a forum or a security architecture, however you want to call it. I don't think we are ready yet to have some kind of a NATO or some kind of a full-fledged security architecture, but at least start with a dialogue that is inclusive of everyone, that is maybe start building from tackling the immediate threats, as it were, trying to dissipate this misperception, because each side look at other as a threat, and then move on from there to build cooperation, economic cooperation, tackle all these soft security challenges that the region is facing and will face it even longer because of not only with COVID-19, the fall in the oil price, but there are other issues. There is unemployment in the region. Their income is dwindling for individuals. As I said, food security, water security, cyber security, all of those challenges that are the region facing, they could tackle it in a collective way that can ensure peace and stability and cooperation in the region. The region is not exceptional. There are other regions in the world that have their own problems, and they have ideological competition, and they have aspirational countries that want to dominate and want to be hegemonic in one way or the other. But they did find ways of doing it. Not perfect, but at least there is a semblance of some kind of a dialogue. What we lack is a dialogue. What we lack is diplomacy. What we lack is common sense. Seemingly now, with the changes in the US administration, there is a move towards that. We're seeing that there is a de-escalation, perhaps in Yemen, maybe leading to ending of the war there. We're seeing that there is, maybe some kind of resolution to the Syrian crisis. We're seeing that there is some development taking place with Iraq, and the dialogue that is already taking place, as my dear friend Abdulaziz mentioned, with between Iran and Saudi Arabia. That's a really good start, even if it's limited. it's a good start. We heard that recently Prince Mohammed bin Salman changed completely his tune from not talking to Iran and taking the war to Iran to actually want to have a dialogue. That is really important. That is something that the region should build on and move in that, because without a dialogue, without dissipating these kind of security threat perceptions from both sides, we are going to continue on the same way. Now, if you want me to end, there are 3 countries that really matters in the region. The Arab countries have really, because of their internal conflicts, have made themselves weak, and they have become subjects to the others to function. And the 3 countries that really matters now is Iran, Turkey, and Israel. And what is needed is that there is some kind of recognition that the Arab countries' internal struggle and internal competition has to end, and between themselves and also between their neighbors, and have something that is inclusive of all the parties in the region, extending from Iran onwards, even including Israel, with, of course, while ensuring that there is the Palestinian rights are recognized, but also including Turkey and so on, because there are actors in the region and they cannot be ignored. The region is not just made of Arabs, there are others in the region, and we should be able to include them and talk to them and cooperate with them in a meaningful manner that brings peace, stability, and prosperity to all. I end here, if you like, Asif. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Babood. Actually, your approach, as if is so, so easy, common sense is involved. This is the way you portray. This is what generates a lot of hope, that if it is common sense which is required and which is very uncommon, then of course we can achieve it. And Dr. Babood, that we had discussed this theme a lot earlier when we were colleagues. So I'm happy that we have all the 3 sectors. They have been covered right now. And now, of course, I know audiences have a lot of questions. I myself have a lot of questions, constructive ones, and we can discuss them. But since Dr. Esfandiari has to leave us in about 10 minutes, I would request the audiences to pose questions which may be specifically meant for her, and maybe she can answer them before she actually departs. So I would request the audiences to raise their hand or either send me their questions. I have, okay, from the floor, Mr. Rajan. Mr. Rajan, could you please unmute yourself and ask your question? Rajan, we can't hear you. If you have unmuted yourself, I can see your hand.
Yes.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. They are all useful. But I would like to bring in China. China must be watching the developments with some degree of interest, if not concern, especially if they perceive US stamina and willpower is weakening. What kind of a role do you think they will play in the Middle East equation? Thank you. It can be answered by anyone, maybe Dr. Dina Esfandi. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Sandhya, if you could like to attempt this answer.
Sure, happy to. I think China is a bit of an interesting one to watch at the moment in the Middle East. As you say, the perception is that the US is leaving, so everybody's kind of hedging their bets and looking east. The Iranians have been doing it for a while longer, but they haven't really nurtured the relationship with the Chinese the way that the Gulf Arab states have. They put a lot of time and effort into building a relationship of equals in some respects, and really ensuring that there's Chinese interest in their countries. The Iranians, it's been more transactional. There's always been a lot of suspicion between the Iranians and the Chinese. They don't really like each other much, but the Iranians know they don't really have a choice as well. They kind of have to look towards the Chinese given international efforts to isolate them under sanctions. And so the relationship has been a little bit stickier. Having said that, it's a very pragmatic, very compartmentalized relationship between the Chinese and the Iranians, which basically means they work together on issues that they can agree on, and they ignore issues that they can't agree on, which is why they've managed to build a working, long-lasting relationship in the way that Iran perhaps hasn't with many other states. There's been a lot of talk about this recent 25-year agreement between the Iranians and the Chinese. A lot of people are painting it as a big game changer in the region. I'm a little bit more skeptical. I think it's welcome news for the Iranians, particularly politically, because it allows them to look towards the Americans and the Europeans and say, ha, you're never going to be able to isolate us again, because now we have another superpower that stands with us. But ultimately, the content of the agreement is no better or worse than any other deal the Chinese have with other countries in the Middle East. In fact, China is doing a very good job of making sure that all its relationships are more or less equal, and it's really gaining from every relationship in the region. So it isn't that much of a game changer, certainly not the way it's been painted out.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sfandiari. I have one more question for you from Amir Hassan, who says, talks actually about the role of the people, that do Iranians favor those policies which are being implemented by Iran? The majority of the people, do they support those policies of Iranian regime, Iranian rulers? Do GCC countries believe that nuclear deal stops Iran to follow its nuclear? It's saying that do GCC countries believe that the nuclear deal will stop Iran from following its nuclear dream, nuclear program? If not, then do they also think of going for this nuclear weapon? This is the question for you.
Thanks. On the first one, I mean, obviously, it's very difficult to tell exactly what Iranian public opinion thinks because people are absolutely terrified of answering questions in a very honest manner, whether it's on the phone or through interviews and stuff. But generally, you can get a sense for where people stand. And the way that it works in Iran is that it's a little bit cyclical, and it kind of depends on what policies exactly we're talking about. So I'll give you an example. Iran generally, over the course of the last few years, because of the problems it's had domestically, Iranians have been very anti-Iran's involvement in the region. So when there were protests going on over the course of the last few years, the slogans that they were chanting were things like, not Palestine, not Hezbollah, bring the money back home. So the focus was really, we're struggling internally. Why are you sending our money abroad? But when there was an immediate threat to Iran and its borders posed by a group like ISIS, the popularity of the IRGC's policies and interventions in the region went up. People were feeling very nationalistic towards the Revolutionary Guards and what the Guards were doing to secure Iran. So suddenly these slogans went away. Nobody was talking about being fed up of Iranian interventions in Syria anymore. The idea really was get the Revolutionary Guards to take the threat as far away from us as possible. And that's what I mean when I say it's cyclical. Today, the economic situation in Iran is difficult once again. And so the focus is very much internal. Why? Why are we spending so much money abroad when we are struggling to feed ourselves internally? And I think that's how generally it goes. In terms of the second question, I think that ultimately, and of course, again, my co-panelists are probably better placed to answer this, but I think ultimately, the Gulf Arab states understand that Iran isn't necessarily pursuing a military nuclear program. The idea is to contain the potential that Iran might one day decide to make its program a military one. And I think that for that reason, they support the talks, even though it's difficult for them to say so. Certainly in my engagement of people in the region, everybody says, look, it's a problem like any other. If we get it off the table, it's useful. The problem is that's not the main problem for them. The problem for them is what Iran is doing in the region, is Iran's involvement in Iraq, in Yemen, in Lebanon. That's the main crux of the problem. And resolving the nuclear issue will not resolve this, which is why I think over the course of the last few months, you've seen a little bit more pragmatism within the Gulf Arab states, Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular, in pursuing very limited de-escalatory talks with Iran in order to ensure and kind of preempt what Iran might do in the region over the course of the next few months or years once the nuclear issues are dealt with. Now, will the Gulf Arabs themselves go for the bomb? Saudi Arabia has made a lot of statements about its potential interest in either buying a bomb from the Pakistanis or pursuing it themselves. I am skeptical at the idea that this is something that is likely to be successful in the immediate term. Building nuclear programs are difficult. It takes a long time. The Emiratis already have one, but they are the gold standard. They've worked with the United States to develop their program in a completely peaceful manner. So I think the risk of nuclear or a nuclear cascade in the region, I think is a limited one, but I do think it's a good idea to start to work towards a zone free of weapons of mass destruction in order to ensure that it's a problem we won't have to deal with down the line.
Thank you, Dr. Esfandiari. Now we have Mr. Flavius Caba. Okay, Flavius Caba Maria. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Congratulations for this event. And I would like to be very straight to the point. You mentioned also we discussed about this current negotiation on a nuclear deal in Vienna. My question is, how do you see the role of Iran after this negotiation, if it's happened, in the region? The role of Iran in the region will shape their behavior. How we'll see? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Dina, please go ahead with the answer.
Sure, happy to take it. As I mentioned in my talk, I think that unfortunately, much like we saw after 2015, you're likely to see a little bit of a backlash if the talks do lead to a deal. And that's because Iran will have to prove that even though it's made concessions in one area, it won't let the world powers dictate what it can and can't do. And so it's inevitably going to lash out in the rest of the region. But part of that is also because the nuclear issue isn't tied to regional issues. The discussions are only on the nuclear program. They're supposed to resolve one area only, not what Iran is doing in the region, which is the purview of the Gulf Arab states and Iran, and for them to sort out in a separate track. And at various times, there have been discussions about expanding the nuclear talks to include regional issues, but ultimately the negotiators decided this wasn't the right format. And also, if we wanted to get an agreement on the nuclear front, if you brought in the regional issues, then you would never, certainly not in the speed and time frame that they wanted to, reach an agreement. So I think you're going to have a period where Iran might continue some of its nefarious activities if there is a resolution of the talks. But I do think that if there is a resolution of the talks, there will be greater interest for Iran to ultimately start to curb what it's doing, to approach talks with the other countries in the region in a more open-minded and wholehearted manner, in a way that they probably wouldn't do if there wasn't a resolution of the nuclear issue, at least not in the same manner. They might engage in a very limited capacity, much like they're doing now, to resolve specific tactical problem areas. But I don't think that they would be as open to a more general discussion with the region on building regional security. So I do think you have to do the nuclear issue first, you have to get rid of it, and then you'll be able to tackle these other areas.
Okay, Dr. Esfandiari, could you take just one last question before you take your leave? Is it all right? Because I see one raised hand. Maybe the last question for you, and then we will move on to other esteemed guests. Suzanne Kudley, please go ahead and ask your question to Dr. Dina.
Thank you very much to all the panelists for your very useful insights. Yes, my question is indeed to Dr. Esfandiari, and my question is about a topic that I think a lot of researchers on the region are keeping an eye on, which is the upcoming Iranian presidential elections and the very high likelihood that conservatives will take control of the executive branch. And I wanted to know your insights on how that would impact security in the region in terms of the Gulf region, but also other areas such as Syria, Iraq, Lebanon. Thank you. And that's it. Thank you.
Please, Dr.
Thanks.
Sandhya. Mhm.
Thanks for your question. Yes, you're absolutely right. It is a very limited pool of candidates and none of them are real reformists. So there does seem to be a general shift towards the conservatives in Iran. There are different degrees of conservatism and some of the candidates are more, others less, but ultimately the ideals are more conservative ideals within those that are in the running at the moment. It's an interesting time in Iranian domestic politics. I'm not sure that will have that much impact on Iran's foreign policy. The main reason is because Iranian foreign policy right now is held, particularly regional policy, not beyond, but certainly regional policy, is held by the foreign branch of the Revolutionary Guards, and they're not going to change. It's the same guys looking and acting on these issues with their ideas, working closely with the supreme leader. So in that respect, I'm not sure things will change that much. Where you are likely to see a little bit of a change is outside of the region, in engagement with the P5+1, with the Europeans, with countries in Asia, things like that. And even there's been a very interesting trend. While the conservatives over the course of the last few years have been calling out the Rouhani administration for failing to safeguard Iranian interests in negotiations with the West, for example, they have also been watching what the Rouhani administration has done. And they've also seen that as a result of the nuclear deal, the Islamic Republic did gain some political legitimacy internationally. That legitimacy even went up when President Trump walked away from the deal, because for the first time in the Islamic Republic's history, Iran wasn't the bad guy, the US was. And for that, they've seen that there is a welcome aura of legitimacy, weight, influence that comes with acting as a decent world power in some respects. And so I think that despite the fact that conservatives are less likely to engage with the Americans and the Europeans generally, I think today these discussions on the JCPOA, perhaps beyond them, will continue because they will want to maintain this aura of legitimacy that has come with engagement over the course of the last few years, and this idea that Iran no longer is the bad guy. I think that to them is quite important. And also my sincere apologies for having to leave. This is a delightful discussion. I would have been happy to stay really, so really sorry.
Thank you so much, Dina, on behalf of all the audience and the organizers. I would just request you to stay, and all the other panelists to please switch on your camera so that we can have a group photograph, which we normally have at the end. So Sharon, our event team lead, please go ahead with the snap. And Dr. Sagar, could you please switch on your camera so that we can have this group photo?
We are done.
Okay, thank you so much. So
Thank you.
Dr. Sandhyari, thank you so much. I would just inform the audience that it was a very, very emergency-like situation, but still she agreed to take those questions. So we're really thankful to you.
Thank you, and apologies again. Have a good day.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And now moving ahead, we have another question for obviously the other two speakers. Mr. Rajan, could you go ahead and ask your question? Mr. Rajan, could you please unmute yourself if you wish to ask your question? Okay. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes, yes. Sorry about that.
No problem.
I meant to ask this earlier. The Russians, they are quite close to the region and they have much more interests and concerns, maritime, energy, and territorial borders. And they must be have some concern, degree of concern for them. So how would they assess this, and what are their likely moves? in the future? Thank you.
Okay, I think Dr. Sagar, would you like to attempt this question? And maybe after that, Dr. Babu can also answer.
That's fine. That's fine.
Thank you.
I think, yes, Russia, they do have a strong relation with Iran, and also they used to have traditionally with Iraq, but also since 6 years, we have seen the Russian in Syria, and the only thing they did is they try to keep Bashar al-Assad in power, but they have not really end the war, they have not end the conflict there. They're trying to be involved in Libya, they're trying to play a role also in Yemen, but at the same time, as a principle, the region do not wish to see another era of a Cold War. Saudi and other Gulf countries have met with the Russian, and they've tried to express their concern. I think Russia sometimes is an important safe, valve for some of the decision in the Security Council. As we all remember, when it came to the Syrian, all the Security Council resolution related to Syria, most of it was vetoed by Russia, and this is why it was not implemented. And Russia will try to use it at best because they still would like to keep Iran in their spheres of influence rather than out of that one. But at the same time, Russia is a producer of a raw material like the region. They do have oil and gas and some mineral. We do have the same. They're not really entering into the market like the Chinese. The Chinese, they do have a product that they sell into the market. They buy from the region a raw material, but they, at the same time, they flood the market with a lot of their products there. So it's slightly different. I think the last visit of the Russian foreign minister to the region here was very much focused on the Russian-Iran relation, and also the way how we see Russia's role could be in the region. Thank you.
Dr. Abdullah, could you please add on if you wish?
Yes, thank you, Asif, and I agree with Abdulaziz, but I think what we also have to take into consideration that because of this fluidity in the kind of the regional structure, and because of this perception with the United States maybe abandoning the region and there is a space for other players to come in, we have seen not only regional countries feeling this perceived gap, as it were, but we're seeing also global powers trying to move in. And of course, China is one, and I agree with my friend Abdulaziz that China is coming with a different proposal and different perspective. At least it doesn't have any kind of military or very little military, if any, involvement at the moment. It's focusing on economy and investment and energy interest, and it's trying to play off and play kind of a balancing game between all the actors in the region. I think Russia is a very interesting actor and a country that perhaps will need to be watched. Maybe, as Abdulaziz had mentioned, we just think about its involvement in Syria and Libya at the moment, but it's also a country that perhaps needs to get more attention than what we are giving to, in the sense that while it is not the global power that the Soviet Union was once, it is still quite a powerful country, and it can stand and pick its space, as it were, and has proved to be quite powerful in that regard. Whether we however we look at their involvement in Syria, they actually stood with Bashar al-Assad and made sure that he continues, and in a sense, when beaten all other contenders in that. So I think that should not be taken lightly. And obviously their involvement in Libya is another one, although it's indirect through proxies. But we are seeing that perhaps Russia is now looking at the development in South Yemen. That Russia has to have this long relations with the communist South Yemen in the past. We're seeing that they are interested in the Horn of Africa. And of course their relationship with Iran. I don't think we should count them out. It's not the same power as it was, but it is very selective in where it wants to involve. And so far, from their perspective, or from other, their countries that support that they supported, it has shown some success. It actually, unlike the United States, in Syria, for example, where they draw a red line and they did not honor it, Russia actually stood with Bashar al-Assad and made sure that he succeeds. So that is something that we should take count of and don't discount them immediately. They're still a power to be reckoned with, and obviously they have interest in the region. They've always had that kind of interest in the past.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mahmood. And from what you had just spoken about the region and the involvement of 4 different, I would say, the representative of sects, Iran, the Persian, the Turks, the Turkey, and then of course Israeli and the rest of Arab. So in that regard, of course, what stands out is Saudi Arabia, and in that particular dynamics, I would like to ask one question to our guest, Dr. Sagar, because I know, and through his writings, I think the world knows that he has been deeply invested in Saudi Arabia's overture towards Iran. So we would very much like to have an update, if I may, on that thing, because I think you are the best person to ask this question. How exactly has it proceeded? Because a lot of interest has been generated in the rapprochement between these 2 powers, because it's not just Saudi Arabia, but the representative of a big chunk of Arab population. So how far have they gone ahead with this rapprochement? Dr. Sagar, if you could update us on that.
I think, in principle, Saudi Arabia, they've had a certain period of time with a good relation with Iran during Rafsanjani and Khatami, but at the same time, in January 2016, when the consulate and the embassy of Saudi Arabia has been burned in January 3rd of January, Saudi Arabia decided at that time to cut its diplomatic relation. However, they kept the Hajj service normally provided, but at the same time, Saudi have felt extremely bad in that one. I was involved in a track 2 discussion between both sides, and until the last November 2019, where we have discussed almost every single issue related to the relation of both sides. And we came up with a great Excel sheet that really defined each one of the topic, whether it's Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, Gulf countries, maritime security, energy security, terrorism, and so, and where we have defined each one position in that one. But at the same time, because the continuous Iranian act and behavior, which really the last was the difficult one for attacking the critical oil facility in Saudi Arabia, which really supply, it's a very big refinery and a very big oil critical facility. I think, that was the crucial issue where we felt, we don't need to retaliate immediately, but we need to take into account all the other, real threat. At the same time, we have been watching the US behavior on the attack on the vessels by the Houthi so-called, which is an Iranian proxy, whether it's the tanker or the commercial ship, and also then the attack on the critical facility. And the drone, the US drone, the US at that time decided not to, retaliate or not to respond to that attack. I don't think we have, progressed much in terms of, reality on the ground, whereby I can't see the Iranian, they want the Saudi today to accept reestablishing the diplomatic relation. Yes, as Abdullah correctly said, in last TV interview of the Crown Prince, he said, we wish the Iranian people the best. We wish to have a peace in the region and live with Iran. I think, as I said before, Saudi are in support of peace, stability. We never used our weapon for against any aggression. The war in Yemen is a war of necessity because of the regional involvement of Iran in Yemen that really represent a major threat to Saudi Arabia. However, I think it all depends what will happen in Iran, who will come into power, how they're going to proceed with that one, and how they're going to interpret, as you have correctly asked, Dr. Esfandiari, how the Iranian behavior will change after re-signing or getting the JCPOA in place, removing the sanction and providing the fund. What happened in 2015 after the signature and the release of the big amount, a lot of the fund was not really used for domestic development in Iran, but a lot of it was used to enhance the military capability of the Iranian and to support their proxy and militia in the region, as we can see today. If there's no change to the Iranian behavior, no matter what agreement they sign with JCPOA, if there is no political will and a change of attitude and really desire for security and stability in the region and not playing a role of hegemony, I think we will still see the tension continues because the four pillars on the Iran-Gulf relation remains different political system, different ideology, belief, and energy issue, and a regional structure, regional security structure. And those four pillars sometimes they do play a significant role of how both sides act there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sagar. And now I have a very difficult question for Dr. Babood, because for the audience, he hails from Oman. And this question is, will we see Oman continue its policy of strategic hedging in the short to medium term? And how can we differentiate the hedging of Oman with the Kuwait? With that of Kuwait. This question is for Dr. Babood from Nitin. So if you could answer, Dr. Babood.
Thank you for directing this difficult question. I think one has to remember that something that we always have to remember, and that geography is destiny. And Oman is a country that is kind of in between, lies between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And they are both regional countries, powerful countries, and regional partners. And from Oman's perspective, obviously, they respect this geography and they respect the relationship with both. And obviously, they want to see that they understand that conflict does arise. It's a nature of contemporary politics or even historical politics. Antagonism also happens, but they always believe that this could only happen. This could only be resolved through conflict and through dialogue and negotiations and diplomacy. And to a certain extent, that has proved to be right, because we've seen all these conflicts that have not really led to anything. And I'll come back to that point in a minute. But just to mention about Kuwait again, geography is destiny, because Kuwait's challenges are even much more complicated than Oman, because Kuwait is again has Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, and it is sandwiched between these three countries. And obviously, it wants to find this space and is playing this, hedging policy that Oman also does, and balancing game. So these small countries in the region, their interest is to see that everybody kind of works in peace, and these larger regional countries actually having dialogue and resolving their conflict through negotiations. That is not to say that they also share some of the fear about Iran and Iran policies in the region. It's just that they perhaps differ in the sense that they wanted to resolve this through a negotiation and dialogue. And I just, if you like, allow me just one more minute, I will echo what my friend Abdulaziz has said about him attending those meetings between Iranians and also people from the Gulf. I happen to have to attend some of those with Abdulaziz and others. And in fact, if you want to go back, this is something that's been going on since the 1980s, if not even before, but at least from what I remember, since the 1980s, we've been having meetings across the globe and within the region. And the Gulf Research Center that Abdulaziz has established and is heading has made a lot of these events as well, bringing Iranians as well as Iraqis and other people from the Gulf to have dialogue, as well as, of course, other research institutes and so on. But we seem to be just talking across each other and not to each other. And also, we are just meeting as purely academics and researchers, and with our opinions that perhaps is not shared with the people in the official positions. And I think these track 2 negotiations are obviously very useful, but what is needed is to move forward to track 1.5, getting some practitioners involved, or maybe even track 1 later on. And this is what is missing. We live in a region that public opinion doesn't really matter much. We live in a region where decision making is made at the top and made by officials. And this is where we need to get to those officials and to make sure they really understand what is happening. It's fantastic to talk to each other, but in terms of academics and researchers, etc. But unless we can get to the decision makers, it makes it very difficult to get our ideas. All of these things that we are talking about have been talked about since the 1980s, and there has been warnings about that this conflict is not going to lead us anywhere, and the best way is to find solutions and dialogue and use diplomacy. But nothing has happened because of leadership perception, and that's what we really need to tackle in a region where leadership perception is much more important than public opinion in this regard. I hope that helps. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mahmood. And as a good friend, you have already answered one question that I didn't ask you. And that question was, you have already answered, because I always used to think that because for some time I have been involved with some conferences related to India and ASEAN. And always we used to have these conferences titled Peace, Progress, Stability, Peace, Progress, Security. But working on Middle East, I never saw this kind of, even titles coming up. It would always be at the crossroads, at the crossroads, at the crossroads, So I think you have just answered the question that why isn't it so? Because the people's perceptions do not matter. So at track 2 or maybe track 1.5, we are not even concerned about this. But the Quranic dictum is that since the start of the humankind, this Habil and Qabil, they were the first ones to have the war amongst themselves, the fratricide. Since the beginning of human being, this conflict is there. But even the Quranic verses tell us that the only solution to these problems is to have talks. So
if you allow me, Asif, in a last meeting organized by International Crisis Group, where Abdulaziz and myself were actually present, Abdulaziz wrote after that meeting, wrote a very, very interesting article, I think in New York Times, Abdulaziz, with
yes. With Hussein Musawiyan, but we wrote another one at the Independent also, where we laid down all the key conditions that can de-escalate and can bring the relation into a better terms.
Right. And I think that's again taking cue from South East Asia or Asia Pacific, or what now people very fondly say Indo-Pacific. We always talk about these security architectures. My contention was that unless we talk about it, unless we talk about the goal, we cannot reach there, you know. So I think personally, I'm really delighted that we have such great people, you know, talking about these things, exploring about these things, and then we may have maybe sometime in future when we can actually related to that. I have one more question for both of you, Dr. Sagar and Dr. Babu, because both of you have been heading think tanks, you know, as directors. So what exactly comes to your mind apart from this particular pessimism that okay, people are not interested, that in terms of organizing these kind of conferences where we directly head on deal with the security issues, even if we do not mention the term security architecture? What are your first impressions about organizing these kind of events where we can create some platforms where all the stakeholders can come and they can discuss their problem? Because if I say Manama dialogue, we don't see Iranians presence there, you know, the way we have Shangri-La dialogue. So a platform where Israelis can also be there, Saudis can also be there, Turkish can also be there, Iranians can also be there, at least for the sake of talking, because that is the first way of, you know, breaking the ice. I would like to have your respective, you know, reactions to this. Thank you.
You know, Manama dialogue, it started from GRC in Dubai, from the Gulf Research Center, Dubai, when John Chipman came and we talked about it. And, you know, we've discussed the idea. Then he went to Bahrain. Bahrain offered him very generously, you know, hosting it and so on. Then it started there. In the beginning, we used to have Iranian participating, but then later on, it became difficult in a situation after the Gulf country had difficult, you know, relation to Iran. I think what you need to have a neutral platform. You need to have the willingness of the party to come, the proper agenda, the right selection of people to participate, because you don't want people to behave stupidly or wrongly, you know, with the other. You want them, you know, understanding your position does not mean I agree with it, but I don't have to insult or I don't have to use a bad manner in communicating. Presenting the cases in a proper way and in a detailed where the other can understand, and honest brokerage is very important. You know, that's a very important, you know, steps and level to do. Abdullah,
please.
If you want me to add something, I totally agree with my friend Abdulaziz, and I also want to add something else. There are currently a number of initiatives that are being done by mainly by European countries and mainly by Scandinavian countries that are funding some kind of regional dialogues that are going place. Sweden, Norway, etc. Germany as well is involved in this, and some meetings are taking place, but it's still very much at a track 2. Maybe trying to move to track 1.5, but however, there's still this vision or this view that European countries have an interest in the region. And since you asked this question, Asif, maybe it's time for Asian countries, given the fact that, you know, there is economic and energy relations are building up very strongly between Asia and the Gulf region. And there is, of course, a convergence of interest here, is maybe if there were Asian countries that actually help to hold these kind of dialogues, that will be probably helpful as well, because they don't have this baggage of, you know, colonial history and of course, you know, intentions, and there is a lot of conspiracy theory in the Middle East as well, and therefore perhaps with Asian countries you won't find that. Countries like, you know, Singapore can actually be very, very important in doing something like this, because it's a friend of all in the country and in the region, and you know, it's not considered as a country that has certain intentions in the region and just want to make peace and enhance economic activities. So perhaps something like that could be useful if some Asian countries do actually get involved or sponsor some kind of a dialogue like this that involves not just academics, but perhaps starting there, moving up towards 1.5, some practitioners as well, or even a government, officials, as it were. Maybe Abdullah wants to add something.
No, I'm fine. I think our time is off now, so we need to.
Okay, but thank you so much to both our speakers and of course Dr. Asfandiari. And what Dr. Abdullah has just said actually alludes to what Dr. Sagar also mentioned, the role of these Asian countries. You had mentioned about Quad, Japan, India, South Korea, and of course we may add to that Australia. Yes, and maybe we can request MEI to really give it something, and maybe this kind of platform could be created. And before signing off, I would like to thank all our speakers, Dr. Sagar, Dr. Babood, and Dr. Dina. And I would like to thank all the audience on behalf of Middle East Institute, National University of Singapore, for taking time to join us. I would like to thank Middle East Institute for organizing this very important event, and our event team led by Sharon. Thank you so much for joining us. We are signing off. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much and goodbye. I wish you all the best.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.